Hello, and welcome. I'm so glad you've joined us tonight. This is your moment to let the weight of the day drift away, to sink into the quiet embrace of stillness, where thoughts soften like snowflakes melting on warm skin. Tonight, we'll step into a candlelit study on a winter's eve, where the wind hums through the prairie and the night holds its breath. Here, a man sits alone with his thoughts, surrounded by books that whisper wisdom, poetry that stirs the soul, and letters that carry the weight of hearts. It's a place where time slows, where the flicker of a flame casts dancing shadows, where snow dusts the window panes like a promise, and where the deepest questions are asked in hushed tones. All you need to do is settle in. Let your breath match the rhythm of the wind outside, gentle and unhurried. Feel the warmth of the story wrap around you like a well-worn quilt. And when you're ready, we'll begin listening, as Abraham Lincoln does, to the quiet voice of hope in the heart of winter. The candle flame danced gently in the study window, casting long amber shadows across the worn wooden floor. Outside, the Illinois prairie stretched endlessly under a quilted sky of winter clouds, and the wind whispered through the bare branches of oak trees like an ancient lullaby. Abraham Lincoln sat hunched over his desk, a thick leather-bound volume open before him. The house around him had settled into its familiar nighttime silence. Mary and the boys long since tucked into their beds, their breathing soft and steady in the rooms above. Only he remained awake in this sanctuary of solitude, where thoughts could unfold like petals in moonlight. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight with a gentle brass voice, but Lincoln felt no urge toward sleep. These late hours had become his cathedral, a sacred space where he could retreat from the weight of a nation's expectations and simply be a man wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Tonight, as snow began to dust the window panes in delicate patterns, he found himself drawn to the poetry of Walt Whitman, words that flowed like a river through drought-parched land, bringing life and hope to barren places. The pages rustled softly as he turned them, the sound like autumn leaves settling into their final rest. When lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed, he read aloud in a whisper, his voice barely disturbing the comfortable silence. The words seemed to hang in the air like incense, sacred and healing. He paused, his long fingers tracing the edge of the page. How strange it was, he mused, that in times of such terrible division, when brother fought brother, and the very soul of the country lay wounded, poetry could still bloom, like wildflowers pushing through battlefield soil. Beauty insisted on its right to exist. The wind outside grew stronger, rattling the shutters gently, and Lincoln felt it calling to something deep within his chest. He rose from his chair, his tall frame unfolding slowly, and moved to the window. Through the glass he could see the world transformed by winter's touch, everything soft and muffled, as if nature herself was trying to hush the angry voices that echoed across the land. He pressed his palm against the cool window, feeling the tremor of the wind against the glass. In the reflection, he saw his own face lined with worry, shadowed with the weight of impossible choices, but still holding something that flickered like candlelight in a storm. Hope, perhaps, or simply the stubborn refusal to let darkness have the final word. "How do we keep our hearts warm?" he whispered to his reflection, "when the world grows so cold?" The question seemed to echo in the quiet room, bouncing off the book-lined walls and settling into the corners where shadows gathered like old friends. This was the conversation he had with himself each night, the gentle interrogation that helped him navigate the treacherous waters of leadership and conscience. He turned back to his desk, where other volumes waited like patient counselors. Aesop's fables lay beside a worn copy of the Bible, their pages soft with handling. These were his teachers, his companions in the long watches of the night, when sleep seemed impossible and the future uncertain. Lincoln opened the book of fables to a familiar page, his eyes finding the story of the north wind and the sun. How often he had returned to this simple tale, finding in it a wisdom that seemed to grow deeper with each passing crisis. The north wind, with all its bluster and force, could not remove the traveler's cloak, but the sun, with gentle warmth and patience, succeeded where violence had failed. He smiled softly in the candlelight, remembering how his stepmother had first read him this story by the fire in their log cabin so many years ago. Her voice had been like honey poured over warm bread, sweet and nourishing, filling the spaces in his young heart that hunger and loneliness had carved out. "Malice toward none," he murmured, testing the words on his tongue like a prayer. "Charity for all." These were not merely political phrases to him. They were compass points for the soul, directions for navigating the storm. Even now, with reports of casualties arriving daily, with politicians demanding blood for blood and vengeance for suffering, he felt drawn back to this fundamental truth, that healing must be chosen over harm, that building was always harder than destroying, but infinitely more worthy. The snow continued to fall outside his window, each flake a tiny miracle of symmetry and grace. Lincoln watched them dance in the lantern light from the street, their ballet both random and purposeful, chaotic and beautiful, like human lives, he thought, like the strange choreography of history itself. He returned to his chair and picked up a letter that had arrived that afternoon, a note from a mother whose son had died at Gettysburg. Her handwriting was careful and clear, each word chosen with the precision of someone who understood their weight. "Mr. President," she had written, "I do not write seeking explanation for why my boy had to die. I write instead to tell you that he believed in something larger than himself, and in believing he found a way to transform his fear into courage, his anger into purpose. I pray that you too might find such transformation in these dark hours." Lincoln read the letter twice, his eyes growing moist. Here was wisdom deeper than any he might find in books, the understanding that came only through the refining fire of loss, and the choice to love anyway. This woman had every right to hatred, every justification for bitterness, yet she offered instead a gift of grace. He folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer where he kept such treasures, messages from citizens who reminded him why the work mattered, why the struggle was sacred. These voices spoke to him of resilience, of the human capacity to find light in the deepest darkness. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 1 o'clock, its deep voice reverberating through the sleeping house. Lincoln felt the familiar pull of fatigue at the edges of his consciousness, but he was not quite ready to surrender to sleep. There was still more to discover in this conversation with himself, still more healing to be found in the gentle communion of solitude. He stood and moved to the bookshelf, his fingers trailing along the spines until they found what they sought, a collection of psalms, the pages worn thin with reading. He opened it at random and found himself reading the 23rd Psalm, words that had comforted countless souls across countless nights of uncertainty. Yeah, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, the words flowed through him like water through desert sand, bringing sustenance to parched places in his spirit. How many had found strength in these ancient verses? How many had discovered that even in the darkest valleys, they were not alone? Lincoln thought of the soldiers sleeping tonight in camps across the country, boys far from home carrying weapons instead of school books, dreaming perhaps of mothers' voices and the simple comfort of a warm kitchen. What did they do with their fears in the long hours before dawn? How did they keep their hearts from hardening under the weight of what they had seen and done? He hoped they too had words that sustained them. Letters from home, perhaps, or hymns learned at their mother's knees. He hoped they knew that someone far away was thinking of them, praying for their safety, holding space for their safe return. Moving back to the window, Lincoln watched the snow continue its patient work of transformation. By morning, the harsh edges of the world would be softened, the ugly scars of winter temporarily hidden under beauty's gentle veil. It was not permanent healing. The sun would eventually melt away this covering, but it was rest, a moment's peace for the weary earth. Perhaps this was all any of them could do, he reflected. Offer temporary shelter, momentary comfort, brief respites from the storm. Perhaps the work of healing was not in fixing everything at once, but in providing countless small kindnesses, tiny acts of warmth that accumulated like snowflakes into something substantial enough to shelter others. He thought of the Emancipation Proclamation, sitting in its cabinet like a seed waiting for spring. It was not the end of the journey toward justice. He knew that much, but it was a beginning, a crack in the wall through which light might eventually pour. Sometimes the most important work was simply making space for hope to take root. The candle on his desk flickered, sending shadows dancing across the pages of his open book. Lincoln watched the interplay of light and darkness, seeing in it a metaphor for the strange beauty of this difficult time. The light seemed more precious because of the surrounding darkness, more necessary because of its fragility. He began to write in his journal, his pen scratching softly across the paper. The words came slowly at first, then with gathering confidence. In the midst of winter, I have found within me an invincible summer, not because the cold does not touch me, but because I have learned that warmth is not something we wait for. It is something we choose to kindle again and again with whatever fuel we can find. A kind word, a gentle action, a moment's patience when patience seems impossible. The act of writing felt like a form of prayer, each word a small offering placed on the altar of hope. Lincoln paused, his pen hovering over the page, and listened to the sound of his own breathing, mingling with the soft whisper of wind against the house. Tonight, he continued, I choose to believe that morning will come, not because I have proof, but because the alternative is to live as if the sun had forgotten its purpose. I choose to trust that this nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal, will find its way through this darkness into something resembling grace. The words seemed to glow in the candlelight, as if they carried their own internal illumination. Lincoln read them back to himself, finding in them a strength he hadn't known he possessed. This was the alchemy of late-night reflection, the transformation of doubt into determination, of fear into faith. He closed the journal and leaned back in his chair, feeling a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. Not gratitude for the circumstances, those remained as challenging as ever, but gratitude for this capacity to find meaning in struggle, purpose in pain, hope in the midst of heartbreak. The snow had stopped falling, and through the window he could see stars beginning to emerge between the clouds. They seemed to pulse with gentle light, like lanterns hung in heaven's windows, offering guidance to lost travelers. Lincoln felt himself included in that vast company of seekers, all trying to find their way home through the darkness. He thought of Mary sleeping upstairs, her face peaceful in dreams, and of his boys, safe in their beds, breathing the easy breath of childhood. Tomorrow they would wake to a world blanketed in snow, transformed overnight into something magical and new. They would laugh and make snow angels and hot chocolate, creating joy from the simple fact of being alive and together. This too was resistance, Lincoln realized. This determination to find wonder in ordinary moments, to create warmth in the middle of winter, to insist on love when hate seemed easier. Every small act of tenderness was a rebellion against despair, every moment of genuine laughter a victory over cynicism. The clock chimed 2, and Lincoln finally felt ready for sleep. But first he moved once more to his bookshelf and selected a slim volume of poetry, not Whitman this time, but Emily Dickinson, whose quiet verses contained storms of meaning in their deceptively simple lines. He read softly in the candlelight. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Yes, he thought, blowing out the candle and making his way slowly toward the stairs. That was exactly right. Hope was not a rational calculation or a political strategy. It was something wilder and more mysterious, a song that arose from depths too profound for explanation, a melody that persisted even when everything else fell silent. As he climbed the stairs, Feeling the house settle around him like a gentle embrace, Abraham Lincoln carried with him the treasures of his midnight dialogue, the reminder that warmth was a choice, that healing happened one small kindness at a time, that even in the deepest winter, something in the human heart remained stubbornly, miraculously green. The snow outside continued its patient work of transformation, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the late hour with bronze-voiced tenderness, like a mother's voice calling her children safely home.